a category that we can talk about here, and I think that's what our speakers are going to do. And it's a lens to look at the three countries represented. From Myanmar is Myat, Thitsar, who is head of a research foundation, Enlightenment Myanmar Research Foundation in Myanmar. Chris Baker is many things. He's a historian and contributor to many books with Pasuk Pongpajit. I'd like to think they work separately together. That's not a contradiction. Winner of many awards, including the Fukuoka Prize. And Ou Virak, who's recently become head of a think tank in Cambodia, supported by the Open Society. Now, why is Buddhism a good lens to look at the three countries? Well, the governments of the three countries would like to say, and there's a certain truth in it, of course, that most of the population is Buddhist, but it's not the only religion in these countries. There's Islam. We've heard some of that about Islam in the previous session. In Thailand, Islam in the Rohingya population, and elsewhere in Myanmar. And I have to say that in Thailand, it's not just in the Deep South. There are Muslims in many other parts of the country, including the center and the north. And in Cambodia, a smaller population of Muslims, but a significant minority well, a significant ethnic population of Cham Muslims historically. And there are Christians in all three of these countries. I think most significantly maybe in Myanmar, particularly the Karen population. So there are other religions, but Buddhism is the majority religion. The other thing I'd like to say about Buddhism is that, just to break it down a little bit, it's a big category. And what does it refer to? Well, it refers to the teachings of the Buddha, the canon, the Tripitaka, the scripture, and I think some of our group here are going to talk about how the teachings of the Buddha are interpreted by particular interests, class interests, party interests, and so forth. The Buddhism also refers to the Sangha. There's an institution of monks that's existed historically in all three countries for centuries. It's a kind of, you could say, I don't like to use this term, I would only use it in this context. It's a kind of infrastructure that is useful to government and people in power, no doubt about it. Not all monks in the Sangha, not all monks are loyal to the government. There are many different kinds of monks in all these countries, in all three countries, but nevertheless, it is an institution that can be talked about under the category Buddhism. And then there are the devotees of Buddhism, the people who practice Buddhism in various ways. And in all three countries, there are various kinds of Buddhist practices. It's not a monolithic religion by any means. And last but not least, and I think it'll come into our discussions, is Buddhism as a rallying cry for certain interests, as against other groups or religions, as against other classes. Buddhism and politics is now significant, has been significant in various ways, not just in the contemporary moment, but historically. And before we go down the line here, we decided we'd go from west to east. I just say that the first question on the program was, what part does Buddhism play in illiberal politics? But it almost is a second question, because the first question might be, does Buddhism play a part in illiberal politics? And if so, how and why? So we might think about those two related questions, not just the one on the program, but that preliminary question, does it play a part in illiberal politics? So first, I think Myat Thet is going to say something about Myanmar and attempt to come to terms with these questions.
Thank you. I first would like to talk about Buddhist. We need to differentiate between Buddhism and Buddhists in Myanmar, right? And sorry, could you say that again, please?
Great.
Yeah. Sorry. Great mentioned about Buddhism and then Buddhist practitioners. And for Myanmar case, when I talk about this panel, I want to pay attention not on the Buddhism or not on the Buddhist practitioners, because I'm actually not clear that I'm also not sure that majority of Buddhists in Myanmar, are they also really practicing Buddhism or not? I mean, they themselves only name as a Buddhist. And I don't think they are really a Buddhist practitioners. So I will only say Buddhists in this panel. I will only pay attention on the Buddhists who consider themselves as the Buddhists and who are considered as a Buddhist in Myanmar, rather than Buddhism or Buddhist practitioners. So, and your question is how Buddhism play liberal democracy, liberal politics. And actually it is also very controversial. For me, actually I'm also a very exceptional Buddhist if I'm considered as a Buddhist. So, and many Buddhists in Myanmar right now, comparing to other religions, say that, oh, actually Buddhism is really liberal, you know. It's paved ways to liberal ideas and democratic ideas and human rights. Then I also, agree, I mean, partially. In what things? Because what I believe is Buddhism is not, in fact, is a religion. Buddhist himself is searching for what I think is meaning of life and truth of life. In this perspective, he is liberal. Buddhism is liberal, right? And another thing is, another thing I consider liberal in terms of Buddhism is teaching as inclusive, all inclusiveness in terms of metta, the interest of the social beings of every single human or non-human beings. It's very liberal. But when I look at his pathways of finding the truth, the meaning of life, I really doubt he is liberal. Because his belief is he has to save his life. I mean, he has to save himself first. He has to enlighten himself first. So this is actually, my point of view is not that liberal. And another thing is, which is also very consequential in Myanmar politics, his teaching is regarding on the sex. So it is Buddhas actually deter monks from doing sex, I mean to abstain from sex, then I would criticize him for not being illiberal, for not being liberal. Because this abstentions of sex for Buddhist monks is resulted in many undesirable consequences in Myanmar society and our present days disharmony in our country. So this I first answer your question, and what I would like to present if I have a next round is the mentality of Buddhists regarding on harmony, and then how this mentality of harmony of Buddhists in Myanmar resulted in disharmony in the society.
Okay, well, why don't we just park that for a moment and go down the line here.
Yeah.
And there'll be another opportunity for you to talk about this, because this is the most important question of the panel.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you.
Chris,
okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Craig. Thank you to ANU. I'm going to take a bit of a risk and talk about history, because I've been interested in the last couple of years in looking at the history of Siam and Thailand using a kind of longue durée perspective, which is like taking a subject and then looking at it over a long period, 500 to 1,000 years. So looking at things like land or kingship or population or these things. And it's an interesting way of looking at actually what is very much entrenched in these societies by looking in the long term in this way. So when asked to participate in this conference, I thought it'd be very interesting to look at Buddhism in this way. So beware, I'm going to start back in the 12th century, but I'll get to the present day very quickly. This is a very stylized kind of history. The kind of Buddhism that is practiced throughout mainland Southeast Asia sort of arrived in the 12th to the 15th century. And the major point about it was that it was a religion of mass participation. What had come before, we don't really know, but I suspect it was rather aristocratic. And it was built around the idea of the ascetic monk, and anybody could become a monk. And this ascetic monk had to be supported by the community, and therefore everyone could participate in this support. And this seems to have coincided with some kind of larger social change, with the effect that this became almost like a religious frenzy, with this form of the religion becoming dominant and very popular, and remaining so through to the present day. But there's two things which are about the organization of this religion that were very important. One is that organizationally, it's based upon ordination lineages. That is, a monk who becomes an abbot because he's been properly ordained and then can ordain other people. And this makes the organization of it very, very decentralized and rather independent from any kind of outside authority. The second interesting part was that at this time, this new form of the religion came in. It did not fight against the kind of locally established religion, the belief in the spirits that live in the trees and the mountains and in the royal umbrella and in the city pillar. Instead of fighting against this kind of what we think of as supernatural belief, it incorporated it within the religion. So even down to this day, it is mainly monks and ex-monks who participate in providing services based on prediction or other kinds of magic based upon supernaturalism. And what went along with that was the belief, in fact, that the Buddha himself was capable of supernatural practice. So it's generally believed by not everyone, but a lot of Thai Buddhists that he can fly up in the air, he could perform all kinds of miracles, he could visit the heaven to give a lecture to his mother and then come back down again, and so on and so forth. He's a very well-traveled character. Now, of course, when this became so powerful, it was very important for the kings of the time to somehow take control of this enormously powerful force. But how could they do so? The obvious way was through patronage, by supporting it materially in some ways. But this didn't really work particularly well because it's so decentralized. It's very expensive if it's that so. The other way was by administration, to try and take control and to create a hierarchy which the king could sit at the top and control as well. And that really wasn't very successful. It is now, but it really only became successful after the Second World War. And the third way they could try to do is essentially by making a kind of deal. The same kind of deal you see in Europe between the empire and the papacy. You know, I will support you and protect you if you give me a religious reason which makes kingship very special and very dominant. for a lot of time, this didn't work particularly well. And therefore, because there's not much in the Buddhist scriptures to help this kind of formulation, as a result, for a long time, the kings continued to rely upon the Hindu power gods and the Brahmins to pour divinity in the kingship to make him very powerful. That only changed, I think, in the late 17th and more particularly in the 18th century, when you come along with the idea of the Bodhisattva kingship. And that was the idea that the king, like Gautama Buddha himself, is a man who is passing through many lives and acquiring merit through those many lives on the course to be, in the end, to become a Buddha himself. Right? And as he passes through those lives and acquires merit, he also acquires the kind of supernatural powers that the Buddha is ascribed to the Buddha as well. So in the accounts of kingship, in the chronicles and other stuff, in the late 17th and 18th century, it's full of magic. The king is very clearly a very, very magic character, and he becomes very powerful. This is part of a Thai absolutism as well. But it's also very dangerous, because it's very difficult for the kings to exert a monopoly on this kind of supernatural power. If it's present in the religion, then others can too. So you get adepts, you get monks and ex-monks who are also claiming to have these powers and can be rebellious. So the same period sees an outbreak of many more rebellions you'd ever seen before in Thai history. They're by and large led by monks and ex-monks, and they tend to be either anti-dynastic or in favor of local autonomy, and they often promise millenarian ends, the coming of the Maitreya Buddha and so on. So if you go back to this period, you can see that Buddhism and its role in politics is not necessarily supporting authority. In fact, it's very ambiguous in its political meaning and very, very slippery indeed. And to cut the story short, from that time through to the present, you see a kind of up and down between this sort of magical form of Buddhism and a more rational form coming and going. But every time it becomes more magical, it also becomes more dangerous as well, and you see the coming of these sort of trends of rebellion and revolt as well. Fast forward to the recent period. I just mentioned two kinds of things that we have seen happening in the last century or so. Obviously, that in the nationalist era in Thailand, particularly the royal nationalist era, the kings tried to incorporate Buddhism into the theory of nation, religion, and king, which became the mantra of royalist kingship in the early 20th century. And this has meant that from then onwards, conservative authoritarian politics can often also appeal to Buddhism and call upon it as a support in the same way they can look for the monarchy for the support for their ideas. But it also has another side to it, which has become less difficult to control and more wayward. And that is that, as Craig was saying, there are many religions in Thailand. And that while Buddhism has become, in effect, the national religion, in law and in the constitution, it is not. There's been a resistance all along to making it a national religion. And one effect of this has been to create a rather powerful, if you like, right-wing Buddhist movement over the last few years, which is trying to press for Buddhism to be made into the national religion and therefore given greater privileges. And this has become more and more insistent in the last few years. The second sort of contemporary observation I want to make on this is about what happened under the ninth reign, the King Bhumibol, who reigned from the end of the Second World War until a couple of years ago. While this sort of supernaturalism and the king went up and down, and that through much of the 19th to the mid-20th century, it was a sort of move to a more westernized, rational kingship. With the ninth reign was the return in spades to the idea of the Bodhisattva kingship, who was potentially also a magical figure. And in fact, particularly towards the end of his reign, this aspect of him became stronger and stronger, and is also, But as in the past times, when you have the playing up of this role of supernaturalism by the authorities, by the kings, it also gets copied by others. So you had a large number of kind of supernatural movements that have gone, that were sparked off within the society right down to the present day. And one of the interesting things to have seen is the way that heretical movements within Buddhism also very quickly became politically powerful as well. We saw this with the Hupasawan movement that happened in the 50s and partly into the 1960s. We saw this with Santi Asok, which came off in the 90s. We've seen it even more with the Dhammakai. Dhammakai is really very interesting because it's a scripturally heretical movement within Buddhism that married itself to being a prosperity cult which drew on the supernatural strain within Buddhism, and then went through the real estate industry to being associated with the politicians around Thaksin, and then, of course, had to be suppressed, and that's what we have seen in the last few years. So the point I want to make out of this is this fact that Buddhism inevitably has a political role because of it's so widespread and deeply embedded in the society. But I think it's too difficult to say that it is necessarily liberal or illiberal. It seems to be capable of being recruited and manipulated in very many different ways. Thank you.
Good, thanks very much. Ou Virak, do you want to comment on the Cambodian situation in light of these questions about whether Buddhism is, and what the teachings how the teachings can be deployed one way or the other?
Well, the obvious answers of whether Buddhism has a role or do have an impact on politics, and the obvious answers would be yes. The question is actually whether it's actually been used in an illiberal way, and the obvious answers in the case of Cambodia is also yes, but it's no different than any tools that is available to any politicians who needs to exploit given the circumstances. Unlike Thailand, Buddhism is our national religion. It's in the Cambodian constitution, and in fact, as Karl Marx said, that religion is the opium of the people. In the case of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge actually took it literally by eliminating religions and the sanghas and the pagodas and the practice itself, and prohibiting anybody from practicing Buddhism. So we had a period, what we call, everybody referred to as year zero. It was also year zero for Buddhist practice as well as Christians and Muslim practice. So after the end of the Khmer Rouge, after the end of year zero, when Buddhism was trying to, when the new government is trying to bring back Buddhism, and that is with the same agenda as most government, and that is always to seek mandate. Even the emperors of China has always seek the mandate of heaven. Cambodian leaderships in the 1980s was desperate for mandates, for legitimacy, particularly ones that was actually, particularly a government that was actually installed by the Vietnamese government, our Cambodia historical enemy. So in a way, a desperate Cambodian government of the 1980s was desperately looking for any tools available to them, and so they bring back, I believe, bring back Buddhism to Cambodia reluctantly, but they only a bit later when they realized that it could be a convenient tools for the government, for the ruling elites, particularly for the entrenched ruling elites. In fact, to cement this view that Buddhism, or at least pagodas and the Sangha, in the case of Cambodia, is actually becoming institutionalized tools of the ruling elites. The head of the monk is called Samdach, was granted a royal title after the 1993 when we were brought back when we brought back after the election, when we brought back the monarchy, the so-called constitutional monarchy. The guy who was actually bestowed as the chief monk of the country was actually bestow a royal title, and he was actually in a way made a Buddhist monk in the early 1980s. While he was a member of the political bureaus of the Communist Party of the 1980s. So in other words, the Communist Party back then made a strategic decision to send one of his own to restart, to bring back Buddhism, and as you can see, likely a tool of the party of the 1980s. It remains to be so, but it's not Buddhism in itself that is illiberal. Is the way Buddhism able to be interpreted by the power to create, to buy the government, the illiberal authoritarian government enough time. One key example that I've always referred to in terms of actually how Buddhism could be actually misinterpreted or how it could be used. It was been exploited in the 1960s by Sihanouk and actually earlier kings before Sihanouk also, and then Hun Sen just realized that they can actually exploit the same thing, and that is this interpretations of merit, of entitlement. And so if you're born a peasant, you're going to be violated, suppressed, abused. There's a lot of inequalities, and your life suffer. That's Buddhism, right? You're born, you have a life, and you suffer. That's one of the noble truths. But then the only half of that, that teaching was not taught, and that is even if you're born a prince, you're still suffering. But the notion is actually if you're born a peasant or poor and you're going to be abused, that's actually because the past life, and therefore you must accept it. You're never supposed to be outraged. You're never supposed to change that circumstance. You're supposed to accept it, only continue to do good in the hope that in your next life and the lives after that, you could have a chance to be born where you can actually suppress other people, which is the opposite of teaching, but that's actually what has been taught in Cambodia, and sadly most of the people buy it because how else to explain their life when there's little hope of seeing any opportunities for them to rise and move up in class. So in a way, Buddhism in the case of Cambodia has been able to be used to cement class division, and this is also translate to foreign policies to public policy in Cambodia, for example, because in the Cambodian context, for example, you are trained to look at farmers as a class, if you're born farmers, then you only need to look at how you can actually farm better, not become a banker. You're never supposed to question anything else outside of your class, and Buddhism has been the main tool that was used to cement that, and for people who's on the wrong end of inequality to accept their faith.
Okay, that point is quite similar to the point that Chris was making about the monarchy and the Bodhisattva, where there's a kind of exchange that takes place between the king and the Buddhist establishment, the Sangha, that they will be supported by the monarchy, but in exchange, the religion gives the monarch legitimacy, a religious reason to rule, and so forth. But this use of the term Buddhism as a tool, it's an instrument. Myat Thet was saying something a little bit different about the mentality of Buddhists and how you think that might contribute to social harmony or disharmony. Do you want to amplify on that point a little bit?
Yeah, so before I explain that, I would like to highlight again Buddhism. I think like other countries, Thailand or Cambodia or in Asia, I think will be the same, how it has been interpreted, right, by actually human beings. I mean, the authorities who can interpret the Buddhism is actually the monk for Myanmar case. And but the monk actually are also human beings. So there's interpretations of human beings, as well as what I think is not only interpretations, constructions of these human beings. So we have to be really cautious about these interpretations as well as the constructions of those human beings in all different ages, right? And those interpretations and constructions of Buddhisms by human beings will have, of course, very much consequential in the development of this kind of mentality regarding on this, what I'm going to now say is about social harmony. And this, my point of view, why it is, why we would like to relate on this mentality of Buddhists in social, Buddhists in Myanmar on social harmony is actually also finally related to this harmony. So, first of all, how Buddhists in Myanmar, their mentality on social harmony is built. So the Buddhists in Myanmar actually is, they want to build social harmony by the avoidance of confrontation and disputes and, arguments. Rather than, avoidance of, confrontations regarding on differences, different point of views, differences among religions or races or everything, They don't want to confront, they don't want confrontation, they don't want to confrontate. So, and then, rather than negotiation or learning about differences, they trying to avoid confrontations because what they think is those confrontations will finally will disrupt their inner peace, every day of social life, So they really fear of this disruption of inner peace and their everyday social life. And then this resulted in this avoidance of confrontations and resulting in the avoidance of learning differences and negotiation among differences. And then another mentality is their belief. What I call is the concept of absolute truth, of Buddhism. What they think is, the Buddhists in Myanmar think is the Buddhism only is the absolute truth. Then, because of this mentality, they quite look down on other religions, Christianity or Hinduism or Islam. Actually, but the most they look down is Islam, but they also think that other religions are also fallacy,
Fallacy.
Fallacy, yeah, fallacy in faith, right? So, but as a people who really don't want to have confrontations or arguments, their mentality is okay. I don't think your faith is right, and of course we think actually is your faith is fallacy, but we don't interfere at all. Yours living with yourself and we will live with ourselves. And then they built these social borders. So this is actually make the divide between different religions and of course different races and ethnicity, because many of the ethnic people, ethnic minorities are of different religions, either Christians or Islam, right? Mm-hmm. And then this divide, this social bordering is later exploited by the political forces, especially after 1988 riots. The military regime, they want to cleanse, actually they want to divert the confrontations and challenge coming from this interest groups, coming from this monk, the religious, Buddhist religious institutions. So the strategy is to change their mindset, to change their pathways to the more nationalist, extremist pathway.
Can we just halt there? Because I think I would like to see if Virak or Chris could respond to these points, because it's very difficult to talk about the mentality of a religious group, and you've gone some way to help us understand it. And I particularly like this idea of the social border. I think that's crucial, but I'm wondering if it applies in the other countries. And also the point about absolute truth, because that can lead to a certain kind of intolerance towards other religions or other groups. And I wonder if Virak or Chris can come at this, at some of these points.
Buddhism itself doesn't have this notion of absolute truth. And it's pretty clear in the Buddhist, in the teaching. In fact, in that sense, it's actually a lot more liberal than Christianity and in Islam. But the way it's actually being interpreted or misinterpreted, that's different. In the case of Cambodia, that's because we're not entrenched, because the society, at least right now, the practice has been very, very corrupt. If you want to see the government and how corrupt they are, all you need to do is actually observe a pagoda. You see how money and power display in the pagoda, and how they can actually feel that they can actually buy their way to heaven in a way, like buying a shortcut, find a shortcut way to heaven. It's very it's contradicting to anything Buddhism. But again, it doesn't really matter. As long as the
more you have, the more merit you can make.
Exactly. It's just as long as you can, and as long as you can live with yourself, as long as everybody else can live with you, with your way, right? And whether you actually earn questionable wealth, for example. So you need to justify these wealth yourself and your families, as well as the broader society. And so people will use religion in any way they see fit with their own kind of agenda. It's very, very selfish. In the case of, I know it's very, very different from Thailand for a fact. We're very different from Thailand. We're very different from Myanmar, just because we're not yet entrenched. If you look at the data, I think 95% of Cambodians are Buddhists. That's pretty much, it means pretty much almost nothing. Because Cambodians is we basically right now, we're pretty uncomfortable with what's going on. We still question a lot of things. And therefore we're attracted to power. Power is very sexy, so we'll basically have Christmas, International New Year's, Chinese New Year, we celebrate the Chinese culture now. Everybody, if you have any connections to Chinese heritage of any sorts of, you know, anything you can tap, you basically will practice some Chinese kind of Hindu or ancestral kind of worships as well. So if you go to Phnom Penh during the Chinese New Year or any of the Chinese kind of celebration, it's really, really quiet. But even for Christmas, and we celebrate Christmas as if we're Christians. So it doesn't really matter, because I don't think we understand what we practice, and therefore it bounds to be manipulative or manipulated by the power within, and the power now rests with whoever hold the narratives and whoever control the narratives, which is actually mean the ruling elites. But now also there's a certain marriage between the ruling elites and the pagoda elites, and that marriage has mutually beneficial effects for both of them, and they're happy with that status quo. And as long as the population can accept that, then there's no need to change that. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything.
Good. Chris, you want to comment this?
Yes, I think in the Buddhist countries of Southeast Asia, just as in most parts of the world over the last century or so, religion has ceased to be the overarching intellectual framework within which everything else takes part, and which was the case, of course, in the past, that the cosmology, the cosmogony was formed by the scriptures and what the scriptures taught. But what has happened over this past century or more is that, of course, we now tend to think in terms of science and social sciences as being prior, if you like, to the teachings of religion. We tend to see religion happening within a intellectual framework in which the tenets of science and social science are much more important. And I think because of that, in people's everyday lives, when they're looking at what we think of as everyday political matters, they are thinking in everyday political terms rather than in religious terms. Mm. So for instance, what you were saying earlier, that there is the ideas of the merit of past lives determining your status in this life, right? I have only heard that ever said by people who are already rich, yes, and wealthy and powerful. The poor people never espouse that. And
in the case of Cambodia, actually the poor people actually said it.
Oh.
It's one way of trying to seek comfort in the desperate situations. And so many people, and this belief of past life and the next life is actually what allowed them to cope. But that's also allowed the rich and the powerful to basically exploit. Because and this is true in many of the Cambodian, I think for many of the Cambodian poor, they basically said, I will basically give up this life. This is a life as one step to the next life in the hope for a better next life. So they can basically use this life as that step. It's meaningless and might be just trying to survive and doing some of these things, take whatever earnings they have to do as much good, including supporting their families and give to the pagodas or giving to the monks who's already filthy rich. It doesn't really matter as long as it can actually find a way to build comfort going through this life in the hope that therefore the next life will be better, and they're okay with it.
Well, if we stay inside the religion, we see certain things, but if we look outside to political culture more generally, I think we have to touch on something else here before we open it up to the floor, and that is violence. Is there something about the religion that inhibits violence? Is there something about maintaining the group with the social border that encourages violence? What do you folks think about this rather difficult, disturbing issue? Because we have had, in recent histories, I mean, Rohingya is one example, but we had a Thai monk in the 70s saying that it was okay to kill communists because you could get merit for killing a communist. They weren't human beings. I mean, you know, the religion can morph and can be distorted to. I mean, some of these Buddhist kings went to war. You can't have a Buddhist emperor that didn't go to war. So,
Yeah.
so there's nothing about the religion. It seems to me there's nothing about the religion that is inherently pacific. But I wonder what you folks thought about it. Anything? Any comments?
Well, I think of the career of Stanley Tambaya, the great anthropologist, who did a lot of his research in Thailand and wrote very splendid books about the monkhood in Thailand, but also about the history of the Sangha. But then spent the latter part of his life trying to wrestle with this whole question of Buddhism and violence as his own country of Sri Lanka was being torn apart. I mean, he doesn't resolve it. He just agonizes, basically, in book after book about it. But very clearly, there is, as in many religions, that kingship arrogates to itself the duty to protect the religion, if necessary, by taking up the sword. And that is obviously a strong, I think quite a strong element in the practical meaning of Buddhism in Thailand and throughout the region. It's certainly not really, it's certainly not, I don't think, necessarily Pacific, no.
No.
I think in the case of Cambodia, is more of identity, in the sense of identity politics as well. I mean, it's similar sense of identity politics. You use language, you use religion or religious practice as a way of actually creating this notion of Khmer, right? Of this notion of Cambodian national identity versus the minority Vietnamese, for example. And this is actually what's been discussed in the last panel. During the 1990s, even the 2000 and 2013 protests by the opposition, it was actually the monks who were actually leading the opposition protests, or joining and leading the opposition protests, or helping leading the opposition protests against ethnic Vietnamese. And it was a monk who actually justified some violence against what they seem to be demonized or demons, or at least somebody who's alien to Cambodianness, which is actually a Buddhist practice in some way. You see some of the photos online of a Buddhist monk, or some Buddhist monks, Cambodian Buddhist monk, who's sitting on the cone hat, because according to Cambodians that symbolize Vietnamese culture and people, and therefore the country. It's as anti-Buddhism as it could be, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, contradiction in religion is pretty much all over. I mean, is all over. But again, this is why I'm always very, very careful. In, you know, I know Western romanticizing the orange robe in a way that sometimes is actually really unhealthy. I've seen this in Myanmar. I've seen it in Cambodia. I work on some topic. When I was actually running the Cambodian Center for Human Rights, there's some projects or some initiatives trying to translate Buddhism in the human rights language, or human rights principle in the pagoda, or the Buddhism or the Buddhist language, for example. I mean, there's a lot of those things going on, but I think at the end of the day, it's a tool. I mean, it's according to whoever want to interpret it, and for the West, we want to interpret the Buddhist practice in a way that actually fit with democracies and human rights, or liberal democracies and human rights.
Tourism too. There's some
tourism,
research
yeah.
on northern Thailand about Western tourists going.
Romanticizing about it.
Well, yes, but seriously taking up the study of religion in exchange for helping out. Well, I think we should open up to the floor because it's risky to talk among ourselves for too long. So I wonder if our discussion here has stirred up any questions in your mind about any of these topics that we've covered.
Some of the discussion's been historic, but I'm wondering about modern communications of the last...
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name's Terry Hughes.
Yep.
With the changing role of communications, where now you've got smartphones and all sorts of mass communications, is that changing the role of Buddhism itself within a political structure in these countries, or is it indifferent? Does it intensify previous attributes, or does it break some down?
Anybody want to give a try at that one?
Actually, Myanmar is very in a dramatic changes regarding on the communications, regarding on this smartphone and internet. Of course, this have great impacts on the society's discussions regarding on the religions and religious persons, right? So one thing is because of those communication changes, people can record many of the misdemeanors of the religious persons, especially, I mean, what I would like to say is monks, you know. So usually those sexual misdemeanors of monks are rarely uncovered in Myanmar. But because of those internet and smartphones, they took the pictures and then they put on the Facebook, and then nowadays we learn more about those misdemeanor, and I think the whole population see the image of this religious persons as a human image. Oh, I mean, even though they are wearing this robe, by which they were put in a higher rank in the social order, right, in the society. But they are just like human beings, you know, and they are criminals, you know. So this has a lot of impacts, you know. But on the other hand, regarding on the nationalist, you know, persuasions and instigations, this smartphones and internet is also a tools to distribute the, you know, distributes the news and, you know, persuasions and, yeah, everything, you know.
One of the curiosities, which I don't understand, is that in Thailand, the monks are, of course, supposed to be practicing at least a degree of asceticism and being unconcerned with material things. And yet somehow the smartphone and the laptop have somehow been excluded from these material things that they are supposed to be giving up while they're in the monkhood. Because if you go into a computer, you know, superstore in Thailand, it's full of monks buying equipment. And of course, there's some justification in this, that they have created quite a big network of Buddhist religious sites. There's quite a large number of those. But I think there's simply more to it than this. I think that this has actually allowed them to escape some of what may be quite boring side of being a monk by being connected in this way.
I think there's a lot of manipulations. In the case of Cambodia, there's actually a lot of manipulations. And that is also the people's desperations for shortcuts to spiritual well-being. So they tend to give a lot of money to the head monk, and they want to do it directly. So monks now starting to control their own money, and with a lot of money, and it's easy money, they got to find a way to spend them on certain things. So it's starting to be a bit more obvious where they actually have your latest iPhone, and they're being public about it, and it's so widespread that they've actually been very, very public about it now. But now they even have $100,000 US SUV, for example, right? And they've been public about it too, because it's the people who want them to be like that, right? That's why the people offering them all of these money, and there's a lot of contradictions, and the people themselves who are supposed to be the main practitioners of Buddhism. Not myself, I don't give a lot of money for monks riding a $100,000 SUV, but other people who's actually doing it, they don't question these contradictions, and it's pretty obvious. But I think in the social media landscape is really interesting because again, it's actually the posting of monks with women is the one that really get the attentions of the public, and that's really intriguing to an observer like myself. I think that's really interesting to see, because I think that you're right. It humanized. There's no longer an aura of monkhood and that orange robe anymore. It's actually you humanize the institution, or at least in a way that allow people to now discuss monkhood or that role in a more kind of practical term. Not in that spiritual term, but then people are shy away from that discussion. So in general, I think because of that, I think social media has been very, very positive. I think positive in the sense of actually allow far more better and more discussions on the role of Buddhism or role of pagoda. There's one topic that I think there's actually a lot more interesting than Buddhism and politics, and that is actually Buddhism and women rights, right? Because I think you have, for example, where monks is seen as, because that hierarchy is very Asian about hierarchy, and that hierarchy is quite established. Monks is above, and women can never be monks, and women therefore cannot be, in the society, cannot be seen as the same level as men. And that's been entrenched in the political culture of the society, and that starts with the pagoda.
And I think this uncovering of human image of monk is also, I think, a way for this violence pathway created by the Buddhist monks. So what I mean is they cannot maintain their image, spiritual image and spiritual role. I mean, this technology change, right? And their human shape is uncovered. So their role is now declining. So they want to maintain this power, and then they also would like to attach this with the political powers, and I think this leading to this nationalist extreme movements of Buddhism in Myanmar.
Thank you. My name is Sango Auntie. I would like to just ask all of you about any observations you have where monks are joining with social movements or other groups that are perhaps challenging aspects of government policy, for example, the ordination of trees in some societies in Cambodia. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that, sort of alignment of monks with different political groups or opposing groups to the government.
What do we think?
Not in the case of Cambodia. You see some of these ordinations of trees. That's because the government allowed that. There's certain limits to it, because unlike the case of Thailand, where there's some decentralizations of Buddhist monks in terms of their ordinations, in the case of Cambodia, it's institutionalized. So the chief monk has to agree to it, and the chief monk all has to be under the Department of Cults and Religion, within the Ministry of Cults and Religion. And so the department has to agree to it, and the department will make decisions on who get to be chief monks of any pagodas, and therefore chief monk of any pagodas will decide on who's get to be monks and who can remain as monks. So there's a limitations of how far these activism can go. The biggest challenge to the government was actually their support for 2013, their support for the opposition, for some of the monks, particularly the lower ranking monks, because they don't benefit from the gifts being given to pagodas. Usually the chief monks who benefit from it, and so there's a lot of pushback against established power, right? And this is also including in the same thing as in pagoda, and you see a lot of activism from that, and that got crashed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. For Myanmar case, there are also a few revolutionary monks. For example, they are using social media. They are doing such kind of question and answer regarding on the gender equality. For example, this morning, Sia Chewin talking about women's cannot wear short skirts when they go to pagodas, and women are deterred to go to certain levels of pagodas. So those kind of things, some of the people questions, and then some of the revolutionary monks replies that this is not what Buddha's teaching, and this is how the society has been practicing, and this is becoming the social, rules and things like that. So those kind of revolutionary monks we have in Myanmar, but they are not revolutionary enough to challenge Myanmar government, or Tamaro, or so. I would say that they are not revolutionary enough, and many of them are trying to be in line with them to regain their power, because their power is declining, because the society is changing.
There's been a lot of involvement of monks in all kinds of environmental activism in Thailand, and quite effective also. And they've also been involved in other kinds of very local protests and activism of various different kinds. There's then an issue of where this sort of activity, there's a line, if you like, a thin, invisible line, where that crosses over into politics, which, if you like, the state and the authorities are trying to prevent the monks moving into this. And so, for instance, monks are not allowed to vote. They're not supposed to be involved in any way in electoral politics at all. And I understand this goes back initially to regulations which were initially about local government bodies early in the 20th century. But this has been preserved, this exclusion of monks from what we call politics, meaning party politics and elections and so on, has been pretty closely policed from that time onwards. There then becomes the issue of what happens when you have the kind of street politics activism, the reds and the yellows that we have seen over the last 20 years. Where does that cross between social activism and politics? So there's quite a number of monks who were involved in one way or another in these protests. But one of them, who became involved in the yellow shirt, Praputa Isara, became very prominent. And he, to the point, eventually, he was attacked, he was controlled by both the religious and the secular authority. So he was defrocked and also charged with misconduct of one sort or another. So he sort of crossed the line. So there is this line between activism and politics, which is policed in one way or another.
Wait, I've got Rungui and then.
Thank you very much. Rungui from DSC.
who said that, you know, according to Patham Vinay, like the, you know, the Buddhist scripture, you are not allowed to use violence. Like there is no justification in the Buddhist scripture to justify the violence. Although, you know, monks carry guns in Southern Thailand, or soldiers are named to monkhood and then they carry guns. That's the context in Southern Thailand. So my question is that in your research, or you know, whether you come across of any Buddhist scripture or in the Tripitaka that would, you know, is there any section that justify the use of violence for any cause? Looking at this comparatively, I'm studying Islam, and there are certain parts in the Quran that indeed justify the use of violence. You can go to war under certain conditions, and that's you know, is in the Quran. Thank you.
No?
You know, on the sutta, I don't know, because I mean, who has read the whole sutta? Nobody has, sure. On the scriptures, on the canonical scriptures, I really don't know whether you could search through those and find any kind of justification. But obviously, in the secondary material, particularly in the Jataka stories, they are full of wars and violence of one sort or another. So whether you're reading it as, it's a question of how you read this kind of material, right? That obviously it's not, I think it'd be very difficult to find somewhere where it said, the Buddha said you could do this. But on the other hand, you could be reading these stories, the Jataka stories, which are very clearly seen in popular teaching as being part of the corpus of the teaching. And within that, there is a lot of violence described, right? So if you like, there's not a direct instruction, but there could be said to be very powerful, indirect instructions that violence is permitted.
But we don't know of any monks that are holding up the Jataka tail and saying,
No, I'm just talking about what ordinary people would absorb from this reading. Right.
Okay, so Paul, and then I saw Liam. Is that Greg? And then somebody behind. Yeah.
Given that this is a panel on Buddhism and politics, I'd like to hear more about the relationship between Buddhism and the state. More specifically, Buddhism and the three states, because I would guess there's some very interesting comparisons and contrasts that can be made. And I recall, quite probably from my careful reading of Baker and Hassuk, that there have been certain episodes in modern Thai history in which there has been greater regulation of the Sangha. First, late Chulalongkorn, if I'm not mistaken, and then in the Sarit years. I'm wondering, first of all, how has that evolved in Thailand in terms of degrees of regulation, and just as importantly, stamping out heretical expressions? And second and thirdly, how that regulation plays out in Myanmar and Cambodia. Thank you.
Yes, okay. There has been very strong attempts since the turn of the 20th century for the state in Thailand to take, as it were, administrative control of Buddhism by having the power to regulate the top levels of the hierarchy. And in its initial form, this was clearly intended to be very much under royal control, and therefore the Tamayut, the royal Nikai, the royal sect or order within Thai Buddhism was clearly given a privileged position at the top, and then the king above that. That arrangement has been contested several times, most obviously after 1932, and has been most interestingly resolved yet again in the last few years, in fact in the last few months, in a very exciting way. In that, after the succession to the new king, there were changes made in the Sangha law, which basically go back very much to the form that it was in the time of Chulalongkorn, and in which the king alone now has the power to appoint the supreme patriarch, whereas before it was, there was kind of some sort of semi-democratic conditionality on that. It's now back to him.
The other countries?
It's the institution is actually under the complete control of the state, the Pagodan, and the state is under complete control of one man. The king appoints everybody, but according to the request made by the prime minister, by the one man. So that's how it works. Just to go to the point of violence, I just want to point out that the monk cannot kill the chicken, but the monk can eat chicken soup. So in the case of Cambodia, I think violence has actually been interpreted in the way that as long as you're not directly involved, you can actually order people to do to do that, and that's actually how in reality is. You have now chief monks with a lot of money have bodyguards as well with guns.
Actually, Myanmar, Buddhism is the main religions. It is stipulated in the constitution. So, and then the states is really supportive of the only religions that is Buddhism, So we have this ministry called Ministry of Religious Affairs, but which only work mainly on the Buddhism, and they don't care about other religions. So, meaning the state really care about this Buddhism, the majority's religion, right? And now, at present, when we talk about state, then we also have two phases, right? One is military, and another one is the so-called civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. But the military is both, phases. Actually, only care about, I would say, the majority Buddhism, and worst of all is what we believe is the Tamaro is and its affiliated political parties, USDP, is the supporter of this movements, nationalist Buddhist nationalist movement called Ninth Movements. So on the other hand, what about then the Aung San Suu Kyi led government? Even though they really want to suppress this Ninth movements, they don't take effective, stand to crack down these movements, and saying to protect other, religions. Yeah. So this is the situations at this moment.
Just to follow up before we go back there, to help Paul on this point, do all of these countries have a council of elders like the Thai state does?
No.
Which is a kind of status thing, a state-led thing, and it's considered by many monks to be too conservative, too sclerotic, and so forth. Do we have these council of elders in Myanmar and Cambodia? Not in Cambodia?
We have a council of monks. Yeah,
senior monks?
Senior monks.
Senior monks.
37, member.
37?
37 member.
Same as the number of nets.
Yeah. Yes, and Actually, we also currently have this divide between nine nationalist monks and this Mahana, what we call is this Sangha's council. But still, what we believe is many of the monks in this Sangha council also really are very Buddhist nationalists, even though they don't openly support the nine monks. Yeah.
I saw Greg and Greg first.
So I guess in a slightly different direction, I'm just interested in the idea of a connection between Buddhism and foreign policy. And it came up because in 2018, Jack Ma, the Chinese billionaire, visited Thailand, and when asked what the Thai people and the Chinese people have in common, he answered Buddhism. And I thought that was an interesting answer at the time. Since did some travel in southern China in Yunnan province, and I went to Dali, and I came across there evidence that there's something called the Chongshen Forum, which is held annually, and it's a Buddhist convening of local of Southeast Asian and South Asian Buddhist leaders, and I'll just read you a little bit of the way to describe it. The Chongshen Forum focuses on Asian Buddhism and the community of common destiny for all mankind, a spiritual bond to cement the Belt and Road. So it's quite interesting, and when you think about China and their interest, I guess, in perhaps some recreation or some kind of tributary system that existed in former times, the ideological connective tissue was Confucianism, which was shared particularly amongst the North Asian countries of Korea and Japan. Is it possible now that China might think about this as an additional means of recreating that kind of sphere of influence alongside shared authoritarianism, shared interest in development? Could Buddhism be something else that kind of connects this region together? And how receptive would the countries, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, be? Interesting.
How long has this forum been in existence?
About 8 years.
Sorry? 8?
Yeah. So 2017 one, I think it said it had been going, I think from memory, it was the 8th.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I probably have to go back and check that.
I have an answer.
Yeah, great, go ahead.
I have an answer. I don't know much about this forum, but the interesting thing about Buddhism is that there is no center. There is no hierarchical center of Buddhism. So each of these countries has its own supreme patriarch. Historically, Sri Lanka, after the Mughal conquest, was the kind of homeland of Buddhism, and when Sri Lanka had problems with its Sangha, there are Burmese and Siamese orders that took root there because, to strengthen it in the face of colonialism. But there are attempts to create the World Fellowship of Buddhists during the Cold War, and there are various other efforts to do this. I mean, it'd be interesting if it succeeded to be a connective tissue, but I kind of doubt it because each country has its own sense of its Buddhist hierarchy, and it cannot, I think would be very, very jealous of any outside country that wasn't obviously Buddhist deciding that it wanted to be a center of Buddhism or to be a patron even. That's my...
Well, I think that's absolutely right. That it's very interesting that there has arisen recently more debate about how Theravada Buddhism should think about Mahayana Buddhism, right? So it's very abstruse debate, but I think it's something you wouldn't have found a few years ago, but has become much more open.
But Chuck had a question? Maybe that's the last question,
Oh, okay.
unless somebody's dying to say something.
Want to hear your view on middle class and Buddhism. I'm thinking of the case of Indonesia, that in the past few years
Well, in the case on the China issues, I think Cambodia would be much more receptive of influence from China in terms of Confucius or ancestral kind of worships. When we're starting to have these connections with the Chinese now, the people will realize that many of the stuff that actually has been practiced, what's considered to be really us, is not really just us. We have a lot of influence from China and the Chinese traditions, as well as the Hindu traditions. But I think we'll feel pretty familiar with all of the new introductions with the Chinese culture. So because of that, we'll be a lot more receptive. In the case of the middle class, at least for Cambodia, I think it's really interesting when you said that Thailand is actually in between Malaysia and Cambodia. In some way, we're actually heading Thailand's way. We're actually following Thailand's way. I'm not saying it actually in a good way, because I said this because there's still a lot of it's still pretty chaotic in the case of Cambodia, which means there's actually opportunities to change Cambodia in a better direction. Whereas I think in the case of Thailand, it's a lot more entrenched, it's institutionalized, whether Buddhism or the monarchy or the military is, So in the case of Cambodia, it's still quite wide open. Well, we're actually heading that way. We're heading your way, and which means that I think I'm expecting conservatism to be on the rise with more people starting to question these kind of virtues and values and stuff like that. I'm expecting the backlash, which is actually right now on the short skirt and stuff like that. There's hardly any enforcement of these things. You can actually walk into pagodas and all you want. As I said, it's actually pretty chaotic. The fact that the government is not doing a good job is also a good thing, because also they're not really sharpening their tools of suppression that well. But I think in the near future, we're going to expect Cambodia to sharpen its tool, which means, as I said, I was half jokingly and during the break that a sharpened tool can actually see less blood on the floor, in a way, because and that to the eyes of the observer might look less barbaric or painful or whatever you want to call it, and that's not necessarily meaning it's a good thing. It just means it could mean that the tools of execution has actually been pretty effective and efficient.
Yeah, for Myanmar case, it is not the illiberalism entrenchment is not only with the middle class. I mean, it is not about the class. It's in all classes, but of course, those who quite strong and involved are also lower, classes, lower middle classes and middle classes, So actually, I think Myanmar case is, the issue is about this majoritarianism, right? 85% we could say is Buddhist, and they really praise this fact. Myanmar is a Buddhist country, majority Buddhist country, and there are also another group that majority Buddhist Burma country, something like that, right? So they really value this Buddhistness, and then this is the weakness, the point that exploited by these political groups, political elites. So by itself, the Buddhists, they don't really interested in other religions. They don't even want to learn about or talk about the other religions. But they really value their own religions and this majorityness, right? And then this is exploited by these political elites, and then finally leads to this extremism. And then, okay, don't touch our religions. And then the extremists amongst what they are justifying is we have each sides. Different sides of the different groups have to protect their, group interests. You know, Islam, you should also protect yourself. And Buddhists will also protect ourselves so that we will avoid the conflict. So this is those, you know, exploitations.
Yes, very obviously, this idea of moral authority as a counter to democracy has become very powerful idea for those of authoritarian sentiments in Thailand, particularly we find amongst a lot of the middle class. But perhaps what is interesting is that the source of that moral authority is the ninth king. There's no monk, abbot, religious figure, text or whatever that is called upon to be the backing for that authority. It's the ninth king. So what now happens with the transition to another reign? Obviously, the memory will continue to be very important. I think that's all we can say at the moment.
And that's all we can say at the moment. Thank you for your questions, and let's thank the panel.
Cheers.